And if it wasn't a lone perpetrator, then it was an intelligence operation. And in that case, the Israeli intelligence service is clearly under suspicion. There is a clear passage in the New Testament where Jesus said something different to the disciples than he did to the general public. Transhumanism is an anti-divine movement in which humans elevate themselves to the status of God. It's exclusively about a spiritual war against humanity. Nothing else matters in the slightest. These secret societies, as the name suggests, are secretive, and at the very top, it's purely a spiritual war. Everything else is completely unimportant. Nonsense.
Yes, today I'm speaking with Oliver Janich. He is joining us from the Philippines. We have a stable connection, and today we want to talk about which powerful circles might have an interest in reshaping the world and who could be involved in it. In the murder of Charlie Kirk. That's the #1 topic right now. The terrible murder, the execution on a public stage. There are all kinds of theories. A warm welcome to you, Oliver Janich.
Hello, Stefan. Thanks for the invitation.
In the days since the murder, you've really dived deep into the whole topic. You've read up on it, gone through many video sources, and have already shared different theories about how it might have happened. You no longer believe the theory that a deranged, left-wing, radicalized lone perpetrator could have made that precision shot from over 100 meters away. But let's talk about the motive. That's being discussed very passionately in the US. That happens less here in Europe. Here, the focus is on how they did it. Here, it's much more about how intense the violence has already become in public discourse, the division of society, this open move toward a civil war that nobody wanted, and especially one that we never wanted. But what could the motive be, aside from the fact that Charlie Kirk was a controversial figure, an influencer, a high-profile host? If that were the case, they could have taken out Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly or others, or Steve Bannon too. Why do you think Charlie Kirk, in particular, became the target of powerful circles? What do you think the motive was?
So, the main suspect in this case really is Israel. There's no way around that. That's just the way it is. There are a lot of inconsistencies, but we won't go into the details today. You can see all of that on my Telegram channel. And if it wasn't a lone perpetrator, then it was an intelligence operation. And in that case, the Israeli intelligence service is clearly under suspicion and probably involved. Also, most of the time this happens on American soil in cooperation with the CIA. And the motive is completely clear. Charlie Kirk has turned away from Israel. The latest messages from Candace Owens also confirm that he no longer accepted money from Zionist circles. And it's implied there that they basically tried to buy him again. And don't turn your back on us, which is exactly what he did. He even addressed the influence of this demographic group on the media in his last interview with Ben Shapiro. And he was critical about the events of October 7th. And regarding Epstein, he clearly said it was probably Mossad, together with the CIA. So, it's absolutely clear. And he didn't want to let himself be bought now. So, in a way, he was already bought since he had money from those circles anyway. But of course, never with the condition that he had to do this or that, because back then, that wasn't the case. Those topics weren't even on the table when he founded Turning Point USA. And only when these topics came up, especially now with the mass slaughter of civilians in Gaza, and since he's a devout Christian, really, as a true believer, you just can't look away from that. And that's also why Candace Owens is so strongly involved. And it's really strange when, just 2 weeks before, so much pressure was put on him from that side. According to InfoWars reporter Harrison, he supposedly told someone, "If I turn against Israel, they'll kill me." And then that's exactly what happens. Of course, it could have also been a deranged lone perpetrator, who also had a motive. In the trans community, on the left, and so on, there are motives there too, but usually, when you push a scapegoat forward, you also spin a story around it. So, for example, the story with 9/11, it was also, they hate the West. And that's why Osama bin Laden supposedly blew up the towers or had planes flown into them. And nobody buys that anymore. So, if it was a secret operation, there's always a story spun around it. And I think that, especially messianic circles, could have had their fingers in the pie here. In general, the cabal.
It's a gigantic signal, also directed at everyone who now criticizes Israel or criticizes the influence exerted here by the lobby. It's a very clear signal, also against Tucker Carlson, against Candace Owens, against Donald Trump himself. It shows, if this theory turns out to be true, it shows, hey, there's something to it. And Trump himself knows whether she was involved in it anyway or not. And if she wasn't involved, or was only involved under pressure, then he also knows how things really work. And I think in the next few months, we'll see very quickly what the official policy will look like, which direction it will take. What are they going to do with the proposed state of emergency or the special laws? And I think it's really hard for us when, so to speak, a system-critical person, someone more associated with the right-wing spectrum, is executed here, that we could then believe it might have been a false flag operation or a covert operation when another right-wing terrorist attack is dug up or when some terror cell, we've talked about this at length, you too, Saxon separatists, Reichsbürger, it all gets blown out of proportion. And we're already sensitized to that in a case like this, it's hard for us, which is also why the alternative media aren't. Of one opinion here, and you just said, there is a very powerful clique, a very powerful circle. You just used the word cabal. According to your research, what exactly is the cabal?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. That's what I found out from my book. The word cabal, so in English cabal, actually comes from Kabbalah. I can read something here from a very reliable encyclopedia that's been around for centuries. And there's really no doubt about it. So, this is the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which explains the term cabal. The term can be traced back to Kabbalah, the medieval Latin name for the Kabbalah. And then, for example, it was used very early on for a conspiratorial group of 5 ministers in the government of England who were scheming there. And that means this term in the 17th century was already common knowledge that the Kabbalists were plotting a conspiracy. And in fact, you can even say much more precisely which conspiracy it was. Among other things, I have a quote from the Israel Forever Foundation. That's a Zionist lobbying group. They write, if there was a difference among the Jews between those who passively waited for the coming of the Messiah and those who tried to force the end by bringing about the gathering of the exiles even without divine intervention, starting from the 13th century. From the 13th century on, those who wanted to force the end were identified with the teachings of the Kabbalah. So you might remember, yes, maybe, that Schiller also wrote a play called Intrigue and Love. So, back then it was basically common knowledge that Kabbalists were working to change the world in their favor. And nowadays, nobody knows that anymore. You can only look it up in an encyclopedia. But what's also interesting is that David Rockefeller used exactly this term, cabal, in his autobiography, where he makes a confession about the accusation that he belongs to a secret cabal. In the German translation, it says conspiracy, but I got the original. And then he also says, yes, and I'm proud of it, he says to the world that we want to create a world. That's exactly what is also desired in the cabal. We'll get into that in a moment. And yes, I don't think that David Rockefeller, where I can prove that the Rockefeller family had already been working with the Rothschilds much earlier, which is common knowledge. And the Rothschilds are, quite officially, Freemasons and Kabbalists, so to speak. I'll get to that in a moment. And that it's all just a coincidence when they call themselves that. I don't believe it. But that's not the biggest proof. The biggest proof is that the ideology simply matches what is happening in the world.
Maybe I can take a step back for a moment. You mentioned that quote from the Israel Forever Foundation. They're waiting for the Messiah. Some are waiting passively and just let things happen. And when he comes, then he's here and it is fulfilled. And others try to do something to help bring about the coming of the Messiah. And I still remember that. I can remember a moment when Rabbi Schneerson said to Bibi Netanyahu, well, what have you done? The Messiah still hasn't come, so to speak. Do something about it. What do people hope for in mysticism? What is supposed to happen? Or what do they believe will happen when the Messiah comes? Why is everyone waiting for this? That's what people know, but could you maybe briefly outline it before we dive in? What does Kabbalah want? Or is it all connected?
Yes, it's very much connected. So generally, if you look online, on Wikipedia and so on, it says that when the Messiah comes, there will be a kingdom of peace and so forth. I'll get into that in a moment, what peace actually means. But there is an occult expectation, which actually isn't that hidden because the world's leading Kabbalah expert, who wrote the best-selling books on Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, born in Germany but of Jewish descent, he described it quite plainly. And I have to read this quote out loud. And there's really no doubt that this is the case. So, Tikkun Olam is the term here, that is, the repair of the world. But according to Gershom Scholem, the world is only repaired when the non-Jews, who are referred to as Esau or Edom, will, however, suffer the opposite fate. They receive their light in this world all at once, but it will gradually leave them until Israel becomes strong and destroys them. Gershom Scholem, The Messianic Idea in Judaism, page 40. That means only when all other peoples are destroyed is the world, according to their view, repaired. And of course, that's quite alarming. And when you look at what's happening in the world, maybe we'll get to that toward the end of the conversation. Things aren't going so well for the other nations right now, but we'll dig deeper into that later. Because in my opinion, the problem isn't just the Kabbalah itself, but also the Old Testament.
But now you could say, well, the Kabbalah, that's found in the scriptures, there are a few messianic. Radicals, even Wikipedia sometimes refers to extremists. And they're certainly not suspected of having any opposing sympathies. But in your book, The Open Secret, which is your preliminary life's work, you could say, your collection of research. I've already recommended it in a previous show, but only in the sense that I have to admit, I still haven't finished reading it to this day. But there are actually a ton of quotes and references in it. Today, we'll only be able to cover a part of it. And you also wrote that Kabbalah is actually a fundamental basis for Freemasonry, which is very often denied by people from those circles, who say, no, we just want brotherhood. We just want to improve ourselves and elevate ourselves. But you say that Kabbalah does play a role among the Freemasons.
That is the ideology of the Freemasons. And that's absolutely crucial. To illustrate this, I'll read. So that everyone can look it up, I'll present a quote, specifically from Albert Pike, who is the creator of the Scottish Rite, that is, the modern Scottish Rite. And of course, he was a Grand Master in many lodges. Back in 1871, he wrote in Morals and Dogma, all truly dogmatic religions have come from the Kabbalah and returned to it. Everything scientific and sublime in the religious dreams of all the Illuminati. Jacob Boehme, Swedenborg, St. Martin and others are the Kabbalists and Linns. All Masonic associations owe their secrets and their symbols to it. And that, of course, is absolutely crucial. Because for that, we really need to do a separate interview. Our self-censored interview also dealt with how widespread Freemasonry is and how much influence they have. But now, just very briefly, the obvious things. Roosevelt was a Freemason. Churchill was a Freemason. World War II. Many American presidents were Freemasons. Those are just the really obvious things. And yes, today it's a bit harder to prove how influential they are. We'll have to do a separate show about that. But in any case, these circles play a role, the P2 Lodge and so on. But I don't know how many books you've read about Freemasonry, but in almost none of those books does it say that Kabbalah is the ideology. And I have several quotes about that, even from a Freemason encyclopedia, confirming that's the case. And of course, that's pretty alarming, because now it really hits home. Not just Israel, meaning the groups in Israel that simply act in the national interest of Israel, but rather, this is a worldwide organization that's represented in every country. And for example, the Israel lobby, it's been proven to be very strong in America. That's beyond question. AIPAC and so on, everyone knows that. But you can't prove that so easily, for example, in every country. You can notice it a bit in the media coverage, but for example, the Freemasons. In France, they're very strong. Of course, there are different branches of Freemasonry, but almost everyone actually keeps quiet about the fact that the Kabbalah is their ideology.
That's exactly what my research has found as well. When you read the official literature, where they explain themselves, or where they allow historians to provide certain insights, the Kabbalah is carefully not mentioned there. And basically, it's the idealistic goals, the noble aims that are communicated outwardly. And what is also absolutely clear is that it's structured like a pyramid, and of course the lower levels have no idea what they're actually doing. They use it to get ahead in their careers, to gain economic advantages, to make good connections, lots of deals are made there, and so on. This really does happen in a lot of lodges all across Europe. But of course, the fact that the moral foundation is supposed to be the Kabbalah, that gets suppressed everywhere as much as possible. And that's also connected to the Old Testament, because you really went deep into that in your book. We know that. Today, I actually want to approach the topic by asking you some questions. Because you say that the Old Testament is by no means simply or purely a Bible of love, break time equals 0.5s / a purely. Communication of neighborly love, but rather that things got pretty intense there, which people don't know. Nowadays, people know that there are some very harsh passages in the Quran, and that there are also some very harsh passages in Christianity, and that there were many fierce conflicts in the name of the cross. But these passages from the Old Testament, while they can be found by anyone who wants to read them, are not discussed publicly. You do talk about them, though. Yes.
So you mentioned something earlier, namely fundamentalist forces in Israel. Fundamentalist basically means that you stick exactly to what is written in the main text, the Torah. And the Old Testament is also part of Christianity, after all. And first of all, you have to say that the Old Testament is fundamentally about world conquest. I mean, that's what people infer from the text of the Bible. That in the end, a Messiah from the house of David will come, who will be a ruler over the entire world. So, in that sense, it's never just an Israeli problem, in quotation marks. It never only concerns the state of Israel, because it's inherent that the whole world is supposed to be ruled. So, of course, it plays a role. It doesn't just concern the state of Israel. And people always think, yeah, the Kabbalah just reads things into it that aren't actually there. In a certain way, the Kabbalah is less harmful than the Old Testament, and we'll get to that in a moment, what exactly that means. So, the things I'm about to read out, almost none of your viewers know them. I can tell you now. I always say it's the most unread book in the world. Many people know some things. And I've already done some initial interviews or shows about that. Then I said, he was the very first one. Yeah, who was the first? I'll call him Jair now. You'll see why in a moment. He had the firstborn in Egypt killed, or had them killed. And then there's some pushback, but it's pretty weak. Yeah, maybe he knew what would become of them, and that they were all evil. That's just absolute nonsense, that every firstborn child in Egypt was supposed to be evil. But now I'm going to bring up some quotes that are so clear, no one can refute them. And I apologize if I read out a few quotes now and talk for a bit longer, but you really have to take a look at all of this. So, do you want to ask something in between?
Go ahead.
Okay. So, Yahweh repeatedly commands the killing of children. Deuteronomy 20:16 through 17. Deuteronomy 20:16 through 17. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall carry out the ban on them. And then he lists the peoples. 1. Samuel 15:3. So go now and strike down the Amalekites and carry out the ban against them. Do not spare them, but kill men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. By the way, this is the passage. Or Amalek is what Netanyahu specifically referenced in relation to the Palestinians. Remember Amalek. And it says explicitly. It explicitly states that children and infants are to be killed, which is exactly what's happening in Gaza. Next, Joshua 6:21. And they carried out the ban on everything in the city with the edge of the sword, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Ezekiel 9:6. Slay the old men, the young men, maidens, children, and women, so that they are destroyed. But of those who have the mark, he was not to touch any of them. And start at my sanctuary. By the way, this is actually about Jerusalem itself.
But couldn't that just be outdated language? Or that it's being spoken about symbolically? And say, well, that's just how it is. It was written down 2,000 years ago, and they simply used forceful words for this battle that was raging at the time.
Used. You could, right? First of all, Bible followers claim that all of it was sent down from God, the words in the Bible, and that everything in there is true, just as it's written.
Yeah, well, then that means this God didn't just preach love for your neighbor. That's pretty clear. The quotes just don't support that. Because, turning to the Christian God now, Jesus Christ preached love for your neighbor. He turned the other cheek, so to speak, and rejected violence. And I think he only got angry once. And that was when he drove the money changers out of the temple. And you definitely don't find statements like that from Jesus, for example. And of course, these statements are very harsh, but you say they still have a certain relevance today. Yes.
I want to give even more quotes that are related to what you just said about whether that was just rhetoric. We have some very concrete things in there, and at that point, you really can't call it just rhetoric anymore. For example, in the book of Numbers, chapter 31, verses 17 to 18, and then verse 32, just so people can find it, very specific things are mentioned that can't possibly be meant rhetorically. And I'm going to read it out now. So now kill all the male children and all the women who have known a man and lain with him. But all the female children who have not known a man or lain with him, keep alive for yourselves. So it's a very specific command to keep only the virgins alive. A very explicit order to spare only the virgins. And now it gets even better. It then goes on to list exactly how the spoils are to be divided. And half of it, that is, this is addressed to the Israelites, and half belonged to those who had gone into battle. There were 7,500 sheep, of which 675 were given as a tribute to the Lord. He actually got a commission. Likewise, there were 36,000 cattle, of which 72 were given as a tribute to the Lord. Similarly, there were 30,500 donkeys, of which 61 were given as a tribute to the Lord, for Yahweh, as it says. And likewise, there were 16,000 people, of which 32 were given as a tribute to the Lord, to Yahweh. This is a very concrete calculation, and so Yahweh gets 32 virgins. You really can't say that's meant metaphorically. It's all calculated out. What does Yahweh do with 32 virgins? And what does a non-physical being even do with 32 virgins? Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment too. Should we talk about that now? What peace means in the Old Testament?
That would, of course, be interesting in light of these quotes, but I can imagine that, so to speak, peace is dictated, like a manager once told me, it would be naive to believe that humanity could ever live in peace. In other words, it's always the law of those who have prevailed that rules. And then they dictate a peace, and the more just and good the whole thing is, the more just it is, the longer the people will put up with it. Yes, given the state of the world, it's of course a pious wish to talk about world peace. But I think the goal of peace should always be to achieve a just peace. Because as we know, for example, from the First World War, an unjust peace is really just the foundation. For the next conflict, let's call it that. But yes, what does peace mean in the Old Testament? You're surely about to bring up some quotes that will throw us all off track.
Yeah, because people are always talking about world peace, as you already hinted at. And at least in the Old Testament, what peace means shouldn't be underestimated. It's an important detail. Namely, when you approach a city to fight against it, you should first offer it peace. So that's Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 to 18. Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 18. And it shall happen, if the city answers you peacefully and opens its gates to you, then all the people found in it shall be subjected to forced labor for you and serve you. That means world peace, or peace means submission. And we shouldn't forget, these are all wars of aggression that the Israelites are waging there. No one attacked them. In fact, I go into that in my book as well. The captivity in Egypt is historically questionable, but that would take us too far afield right now. So, they absolutely didn't attack anyone. In other words, no one attacked them. And it's specifically about going to cities that are far away. So, the cities that are nearby, you're supposed to destroy them immediately. And only to those that are farther away do you offer peace. And that means complete submission. Because they knew, though I won't go into detail now, that Yahweh, so to speak, had a secret weapon. And the deal was basically this: either you submit or you get wiped out. All the men were killed at that point. And then the women and children could be seized, so to speak, by the Israelites. And yes, of course, it goes on even further. And now we come to the most controversial part. I don't know if you have any questions before we get to the most controversial part of the interview.
Yeah, well, I think that it's already pretty controversial now. I'm sure I'll get a lot of messages again, especially from people who care deeply about the Old Testament and Christianity. And of course, they'll say that all of this is being overinterpreted, that these are just historical writings. But we'll get to that as we go along. I mean, this interview won't end before I ask you, of course, what impact all of this actually has today. I have to say, in the shows I've done, for example, about the Gaza War, and about the Greater Israel idea and the Greater Israel strategy, which is now visibly unfolding before our eyes, we've also shown excerpts about that. From mainstream television, where Israeli soldiers openly say, yes, we believe in the old teachings, we believe in the Old Testament, we believe in the Greater Israel promise, and we go in there just as we've always done, for thousands of years. And that's what they base themselves on. On their brutality, that's what they refer to. There are these terrible videos on social media where Israeli soldiers say, I'm looking for the children in this house right now, I've already taken care of 2 today. And where it's basically about slaughtering everyone. On the other side, of course, these crimes happen just the same, so we absolutely must not relativize it now. It's not about saying that only the Israeli army commits such crimes, but clearly, on October 7th. We all saw what happened. This was directed against civilians. The same goes for the terrorist attacks, the terror assaults. They always target civilians, non-believers, and, in our eyes, of course, innocent people. But one thing has nothing to do with the other. Today, we actually want to focus on the introduction. Kabbalah, and now we're in the Old Testament. So yes, I suppose that's right. It can't really get much worse, but as we know, Oliver Janet always manages to take it up a notch. So, what's coming next?
It actually does get even worse, maybe at this point, just so the Christians don't tune out. I saved Christianity towards the end of the conversation, because I say that Jesus fought exactly against these things. But that comes at the end.
That's also the subtitle of your book. Your book's subtitle also mentions the revolution of Jesus Christ against the Brotherhood. You also have the revolution of Jesus Christ, which, just from the subtitle, suggests that there was indeed a struggle here.
Exactly. So he fought precisely against these things. But we'll get into that in more detail, because now it really gets terrible. Now there's nothing left that anyone can deny. And this is a passage that absolutely no one knows, except for the readers of my book. And I also tried to find out who has written about it. I haven't found anyone. Of course, there will be someone out there who has talked and written about it, but among the more prominent figures who even discuss this topic, I found no one. I've read over 100 books about it. I haven't found it anywhere. And I also hope you'll display this, because this quote is a confession from Yahweh, namely Ezekiel 20:26 in the translation. Hope for all. I even allowed them to burn their eldest sons as sacrifices and to defile themselves in such a terrible way. Through this, you should be shocked and realize that I am the Lord, that is, I, Yahweh. At this point, Yahweh actually admits that he demanded human sacrifices, and for a specific purpose, so that they would be frightened and recognize who he is. In this context, it's also interesting that he was apparently called Baal in the past, because in Hosea 2:16 it says, "On that day, declares the Lord, Yahweh, you will call me my husband, and will no longer call me my Baal. You will call me my husband, and will no longer call me my Baal." There's also a controversy about whether Baal was really the god to whom people were sacrificed. But at the very least, it's a clue. And in this context, it's also very important to note that there are theologians who believe that Moloch, as we know, these sacrifices to Moloch, human sacrifices to Moloch, was not a god, but rather a ritual. And even Shabbat Lubavitch talks about this in an article on their website. Throughout the entire Tanakh, there are many references to a ritual called Moloch, in which children were thrown through fire. And there are many warnings from God not to do this. But we just heard that God, well, yes, you really have to call him that, because to me that's not God, and I'll explain why in a moment, allowed it and then suddenly changed his mind. But I mean, what kind of God even starts by allowing people to be sacrificed? Now the big question is, did he really change this practice? So, in the Old Testament, there's no indication that he himself, after that passage, ever demanded again that people be thrown into the fire. But all the children were sacrificed, after all. I mean, if I kill the enemy's children, they're innocent too, so that's a kind of human sacrifice. But the craziest thing is, he definitely ended this practice for the Israelites, but at a price. Numbers 18, Yahweh to Aaron, the brother of all living beings that break the womb and are presented to the Lord, both human and animal, belong to you. So, Aaron, you must redeem the firstborn among the people. And likewise, you must also redeem the firstborn animals from unclean livestock. You are to redeem them when they are 1 month old, according to the valuation, with 5 shekels of silver, according to the sanctuary shekel weight, which is 20 gerahs. That means the firstborn animals had to be redeemed, as well as the firstborn humans. At this point, it's not clear how people are supposed to be redeemed. Again, a note, Exodus 34. Genesis 34, verse 19. All firstborn sons are mine, as are all the firstborn males of your livestock, whether cattle or sheep. There's nothing to be gained here. All firstborn sons belong to him, but must be redeemed. And that's with money, which is already very strange for a non-physical phenomenon. So, and that is my interpretation of circumcision. Circumcision is a substitute for human sacrifice. I don't think anyone has thought of that yet. But we have 2 here. Moses 4. And when Moses was on his way and stayed at the inn, Yahweh came to meet him and wanted to kill him. He came towards him and wanted to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his genitals with it, saying, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." Then he let him go. But she said, "Bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. So, as a substitute for the killing of Moses, there was a circumcision. And now it becomes even clearer. Genesis 17. An uncircumcised worker who is not circumcised in his foreskin shall be exterminated from his people. He broke my covenant. So you only have the choice between circumcision, which is something that affects the child, or killing him. So obviously, circumcision is a substitute for this blood sacrifice, because the only choice left is to sacrifice the foreskin or be killed. Just having to talk about things like this is, of course, already disgusting, but unfortunately that's how it is in the Old Testament. It really couldn't be any clearer. He once demanded human sacrifice, whether it was stopped or not. You could debate that now, but as I said, slaughtering children, even those of the enemy, is a kind of human sacrifice. And I haven't met a single theologian yet. I'm happy to discuss this with anyone, but how are you supposed to explain that passage? Or what comes to your mind about it?
Yeah, well, I actually haven't really dealt with that topic yet, because I think that in religions there are intimate, mystical. There are traditions and stories that are reserved for religions themselves to practice and define. But you brought it up here for a different reason and apparently prepared it for this conversation, because you want to present this human sacrifice theory, since you say, yeah, God Yahweh demanded human sacrifices. He wanted to frighten his own people with it, so to speak, to show his position, that he can be terrifying. You've shown that with many quotes here. I've also done research on this, but haven't published anything yet. There are some truly horrific passages in there that glorify violence, war, and death. But I've also found that people often argue very strongly, saying, yeah, those are just the old passages, don't weigh everything so heavily. As I said, we'll get to that. But you just quoted that in the context to prove that human sacrifices were demanded, and that there was a way out, which you just briefly presented here as a thesis. I'm curious to see if any theologians or scholars of religion will chime in here. You hold a different opinion on this. By the way, I've also read other theories about this, but that would take us too far right now. So, yeah, I think this.
Well, if you want, which ones? I can't think of any theory at all that could somehow excuse these passages. Or don't you think so?
Well, when it comes to these religious rituals like circumcision or so, I've heard other theories about that, but from my point of view, there aren't any. Excuses one way or another. I think every religion should be allowed to have passages in historical texts that are just as cruel to our modern ears as they are incomprehensible. For me, the question is always, what impact does that have on today? And that was also the starting point, and we're about to get back to that. For me, as a journalist, it's absolutely clear that I know this is a minefield, that you're not supposed to talk about it. That we are immediately accused of anti-Semitism again. That we are immediately accused of repeating a centuries-old conspiracy theory about supposed world domination. But these are quotes from the Old Testament. And I think the viewer is mature enough. We're not broadcasting today on state-mandated TV where people are just fed whatever's on the box. Instead, we have responsible media consumers, and I want to call on them right now. We've also shown the quotes on screen just now. Do your own research, pick up the Old Testament, look it up online, and find these passages for yourselves. And I did the same in preparation for this conversation. And these are quotes that you're not supposed to report on, where you're threatened if you do. If you talk about them, you'll get into serious trouble. We know that, and we discussed it before this interview as well. But it's simply part of the bigger picture that people should be aware of these things. And at this point, I can also refer to Oliver Janich's book, because we're not going to spend another 2 hours reading quotes, but the book goes into much more detail, including the sources mentioned.
Yes, and what also needs to be said is that this doesn't just concern the Old Testament religion, but also Christianity. So all Abrahamic religions, that is, the major world religions, worship a being that, as can be proven, has demanded human sacrifices. And then just take a look at the world. Every war is a human sacrifice. Is that just a coincidence? Of course, the believers of these religions don't know anything about this. But my book is called The Open Secret because, in fact, anyone can look it up. So, what state is the world in? And then we have here a being, and I've already hinted at it, obviously a physical being. Because what would a non-physical being do with livestock and money? It's clearly a physical being that's being worshipped here. And as I said, I'm going to clarify that in a moment. Because Jesus fought exactly against this. I'll make that pretty clear as well. But I also want to mention, almost forgot about it, this passage. In the book of Judges 11, Jephthah sacrifices his own daughter. So, that happens even after this passage. So, and now for the good news. I don't know if we've already gotten to this, that Jesus actually denied it.
That this is his father. I'd like to get to that now, because what is absolutely clear to me. You mentioned the word Amalek, and I also have my own experiences with this term, and this term keeps coming up again and again, also throughout history. and the Amalekites were the enemies of the people of Israel. And they didn't call themselves that. They were given that name. And that's already written in these very old scriptures, in the Old Testament itself. You also read out the key passage. And then there are also stories that even Kaiser Wilhelm was called that. Thorsten Schult also discusses that he was already referred to as Amalek and had no idea why. So, he himself was not aware of any guilt, but he was called Amalek. And even today, you mention the Egyptians, you mention the Palestinians, the war in Gaza, the corresponding statements by Israeli ministers. Amalek is constantly being brought up. That means they're already heavily referencing these old terms and probably also know the relevant passages. Now, I know these quotes in a modified context, changed, softened, modernized. For example, from the Chabad Lubavitch, this large. Also, according to official sources, a messianic sect that has a lot of influence all over the world. And they deal quite openly with their end times mentality and, surprisingly, still manage to gain access to Donald Trump and other powerful people. But maybe we'll get to that later. Yes, maybe.
I can say two things about that in relation to Germany. You've already mentioned it. Germany was already referred to as Amalek by these circles. There wasn't a Nazi in sight back then.
Yes, Kaiser Wilhelm, exactly. To put it in context, there were no National Socialists or NSDAP then.
Exactly. And in that context, one has to be very careful with this topic, but when it comes to this subject. It's also interesting that the then leader of Chabad Lubavitch, Schneerson, was rescued by someone. Now, I didn't know we'd get onto this topic, but he was.
I don't want to go too deep into it. I really don't want to dig too much into it, because, as you said, it's obviously a sensitive issue, but it keeps coming up. So, that's something we should keep a close eye on. That brings up the question, I've been dying to ask this since minute 2. What impact do these historical writings have today? But let's push that question back a bit further, because another important question is, as you said, Jesus Christ. What was his opinion on this? Or how did he position himself?
Well, he did speak to representatives of this group of people. It's stated very clearly in John 8:31 and then 44. You have the devil as your father, and you want to do the desires of your father. He is a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. So, that's what he said to the Israelites. Not just some select group of Pharisees, like he does in another passage. What many people also don't know is that the Talmud is the written record of the Pharisees' teachings. What Jesus says about the Pharisees, anyone can check that for themselves. But a lot of people don't know that either. So, it was an oral tradition of the Pharisees, and then it was written down in the Talmud. But Talmud, that would be another 5 episodes.
But the passage is from the New Testament, the one you just mentioned. This passage is from the New Testament, the one you just read aloud.
And then Mark 12, verses 35 to 37. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he asked the question, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If David calls the Christ Lord, how then can he be David's son? Jesus very clearly rejected being the son of David, and thus the Messiah from the house of David. Another indication that Jesus does not see Yahweh as his father is Matthew 7:9 through 10. Or is there anyone among you who, if his son asks him for bread, would give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, would give him a snake? In the Old Testament, in Numbers 21:5 through 6, the Israelites complain that they are hungry. And Yahweh responds by sending snakes. And maybe just very briefly, of course, many Christians know this, Jesus blessed the children and said that for anyone who harms them, it would be better if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea. So, a completely different attitude toward children than in the Old Testament. And maybe here, well, I'll let you go first. Object, if you have any objections to that.
I don't think there's anything to object to. Of course, I don't yet know the questions that will reach me after the show, probably from some people, specifically about Jesus' position on this matter. But for now, I would.
I'll just say in advance what you're going to hear, because I hear it too. There are some very clear passages in the New Testament that refer to the Old Testament, and you have to consider who actually wrote the Gospels. They were Israelites, writing 30 to 70 years after his death. These were Israelites who wanted to convince their fellow Israelites that Jesus was their Messiah. So today, for example, Messianic Jews, they believe in Jesus Christ because they also say that's exactly what was foretold. And there are countless passages, so many places where there's a real connection to the Old Testament. But the things I just pointed out actually contradict those. Now, you could argue that you're just picking out what suits you best. The funny thing is, for example, in the Apocrypha, in the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, none of that appears, no talk of messianic expectations, and so on. All those things that come from the Old Testament aren't found there. And in my opinion, that's the oldest. But now, here's my argument. I say, if even in the Gospels written by the Israelites there are still passages left that suggest it's not the same God, then those passages are obviously more valuable than the ones that were twisted to refer back to the Old Testament. That just makes sense. That basically survived censorship, and Peter, for example, was a student of the rabbis. Paul was a student of the rabbis. There's even this theory that Christianity was invented to spread the Old Testament faith all over the world. And many rabbis say that too. Not that it was invented, but they say, yes, we're grateful for Christianity because it spread the Old Testament teachings all over the world. But I argue that, in reality, my book actually taught something completely different. We'll get to that in just a moment. So, that would be my answer to what you're going to get there. But I also enjoy discussing this with theologians. But of course, they throw all those quotes at me. The ones that refer to the Old Testament. But those were written by them 30 years later to convince the Israelites to confess to Jesus.
But according to your thesis, what do you think Jesus actually taught?
Yeah, well, that's the big secret that I only reveal in the book, but soon also in a video. I know, people always hate it when I say that. But I hate it when someone spoils the ending of a movie for me. I just don't like that. And that's why I want as many people as possible to keep the suspense before I reveal publicly what the exact secret is. But I can give you a rough idea. Jesus was also absolutely clear. He himself was the founder of a mystery school. And here I have to read the quotes out loud again, so no one can dispute it. Matthew 13:11. He answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. But to them it has not been given. His disciples ask him why he tells the general public something different than he tells them. And the word used there for mysteries, mysteria, is clearly defined. For example, Thayer's Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament, first published in 1989, defines it as such. So, there is a clear and significant passage, specifically in the New Testament, where Jesus said something different to his disciples than to the general public. Break time equals 0.5s / to his disciples, he spoke in parables, in allegories. And I analyze the parables, and from that I derive the mystery school that he taught. But broadly speaking, it's the teaching of how you can establish an individual connection to God, not to found a church. He clearly said, my kingdom is not of this world. The kingdom of God is within all of us. No one disputes that. It's not about an earthly kingdom, but about an inner kingdom, or as I interpret it, the spiritual world. And he taught how one can connect with this spiritual world. And I have cross-checked that with things that are taught today. I also compared it with scientific findings from quantum physics. He taught things that can now be proven through certain experiments. So, it wasn't about that for him, it was about, and that's even an open topic in theology. It's well known that he put an end to all those rules, 613, I think, mitzvah from the Old Testament. It's well known that he put an end to them. Those rules, they no longer apply. Instead, there is this one commandment, which is the commandment of loving your neighbor. That's basically official. But just from that alone, he should already conclude, okay. But if those were the rules from the Old Testament, did he then turn against God? No, his father was the true God. He turned against Yahweh. And you can debate that theologically, but it's absolutely clear that the message in the New Testament is different from the one in the Old. And Malmach clearly recognized that Yahweh was not his father, but that God is his father.
I suppose I'll venture a prediction that this centuries-old dispute, which you've now joined as well, with all its interpretations, will probably continue for several more centuries. But in fact, it's a theory that's also meant to put us on a track to show us how today. This kind of spiritual debate might look. You mentioned that Jesus also founded a mystery school. There were already such schools, there were think tanks, and of course, there were already secret societies at that time. Otherwise, according to your book, Jesus Christ wouldn't have had to start a revolution against a brotherhood. You also said he was against an earthly kingdom, but the Vatican, in his name, has established an earthly kingdom here. For centuries, the popes were more influential than any king or prince. But even in ancient Rome, these forces were already at work. There were many intrigues on the political level, but you also say there are or were secret societies.
Exactly, and through the criticism. I always welcome criticism, and because of it, I've actually sharpened my thesis even further. That's not in a print book yet, but it will be in the ebook. But now, you're all basically getting this for free. So, there's a work by Professor Michael E. Stone, published in Oxford in 2017, called Secret Groups in Ancient Judaism. It also deals with the time of Jesus, showing that secret societies were extremely widespread back then. And here's the important part, among the elites. And Jesus wanted to teach these secrets to the common people. He took in fishermen and so on. Back then, and it says so. Also, in the book, it says that these secrets were reserved for the elites, and they used them, but for evil purposes. So, you can use these techniques for good or for evil. And Jesus was sentenced to death by the Sanhedrin. That was the highest Jewish council at the time. And then he was sentenced to death by the Roman state. So why did both of them agree? To understand that, you have to know that. The Roman procurator Valerius Gratus appointed Caiaphas as the high priest of Israel and as the head of the Sanhedrin. That means he was appointed by Rome. Emperor Tiberius, in turn, appointed Gratus as the prefect of the province of Judea. And now here's the thing, Tiberius, the emperor, he himself was the founder of a secret society. You can even look it up on Wikipedia, and it was called Sodalis Augustalis. So that was a cult, though we don't usually call it that. Secret society, but cult or sect is basically the same thing. And now here's the real shocker. There was actually a Roman writer who reported about Tiberius and how he stayed on Capri. And the Roman writer Suetonius reported on sexual perversions, including child abuse, as well as his cruelty and paranoia. So, even back then, they were dealing with the same problems we face today. And this is now clear. Caiaphas was appointed. They wouldn't have appointed Caiaphas if he hadn't been part of the elite and a secret society himself. And these are the people Jesus fought against, and these are the same kinds of people we're dealing with today. And the successors of this organization are the Freemasons, who also have the Kabbalah as their ideology. And also the goal, so far I haven't mentioned this yet, I think we talked about it in another interview, yes, to strive for a world republic. So, a world government. And Jesus himself said, no, my kingdom is not of this world. So, the exact opposite. And the opposite of what these secret societies wanted back then and still want today. And that's why I say, I'm actually saving Christianity by saying, no, so. This Old Testament God was not the God of Jesus Christ and is not the God of all of us. That means, if there are still Christians listening who haven't tuned out yet, who've heard this, engage with Christianity, with true Christianity, because true Christianity is, in my opinion, what today are called Christian mystics. Just type it in, Christian mystics, on Wikipedia and you'll find a list. Ironically, I quoted one of them, Meister Eckhart, in my very first book, not knowing that I would come back to this topic again. And that's someone you can really take a look at. And actually, that's kind of my conclusion. All these religions have mystical traditions. So I'm not talking about the evil secret societies, but about them. mysteries of the universe that these mystery schools have taught. They exist in all three religions. There would be no reason anymore to bash each other's heads in, because these mystery schools teach you how to build a personal connection to God. You don't need a church for that, and you don't need to fight about it either, because everyone can believe in what they want and try to build a personal connection to God themselves. To build it. And there's no reason anymore to bash each other's heads in. That's my positive outlook.
Yeah, so I think that really was a bit of a signal of redemption. You actually have a chapter in the book about redemption, about awakening. Of course, I don't want to give that away now. I haven't gotten that far in the book yet myself. I've only seen it in the table of contents. I think it really is. The arc you've drawn here once again points in the direction that you have to engage with things. And once you have engaged with things, then you gain certain insights into things. And now that you've mentioned the teachings of Jesus, but also many nature religions and many people who don't feel connected to any world religion, especially in recent years, have felt a strong need. There's something greater out there. We're not just rational machines, as Harari says, but there is something spiritual in this world. All the people I know in my circle, and I'm very grateful for that, even if my circle sometimes only extends visually to the Philippines or through the internet, all of them want a prosperous future. And that's for all people and all nations on this earth, including those nations that don't always have the best moral or religious foundations, and that can sometimes be stubborn or even malicious toward others. And I think every creature is simply a thought of God. As Hertha already said, every nation is a thought of God, and every living being has a right to exist. And so, in my opinion, and I think most of our viewers will agree, we should strive for a life that makes living side by side and together possible. And not, as radical groups on all sides keep pushing and promoting, that everything turns into a big brawl, that war is always chosen as the solution right away. Instead, it should be about reconciliation. And we know this from personal, individual arguments as well. At some point, there has to be a moment when you sit down at the table and make compromises. Otherwise, it remains an endless conflict, an endless struggle. We see it in never-ending divorce dramas or in wars between peoples where peace hasn't come for decades. And now I finally get to my question, which I've been carrying with me this whole time. How much importance do you actually attach to this Kabbalah teaching in the quotes from the Old Testament, the Messianic circles? I'll just say it up front. We accept. Marcus Krall also showed this in that debate about Gaza, that very civilized, cultured debate, and he said, yes, there are crazy circles on all sides. But without going too far out on a limb or making any overly bold assumptions, we can quite safely and reasonably assume that there are indeed certain circles, groups, or communities in Israel that hold very radically, even extremely, to the old, traditional teachings, including the specific quotes and passages you mentioned today. These are people who still, to this very day, say, yes, the old written word is, in fact, our law, and we must continue to follow it. But especially in Christianity in Europe, there are now many people who identify with Christian teachings, ethics, and morals, and who say, but what is written literally in the New Testament or the Old Testament of the Bible, that's not important to me. What's important is the message behind it. What's important is love for one's neighbor. What's important is what is being taught to us. Trust in God. And how important is this small group that takes things literally, like the ambitions for world domination, the messianic passages, how important is this group? And my last half sentence. Many of my interview partners, I already mentioned Marcus Krall, but this is also brought up by Ernst Wolf or Monica Donner, who say, look, don't get hung up on some mystical religious topics. The big tech corporations, the financial elite, they've taken over everything by now, and they're much more influential than any religious circles. What do you say to that? What is the real significance for today?
So that was a bit long. There were several points, but I'll start at the end. It's exclusively about this. Exclusively about these spiritual matters. I'm actually proving this right now with the heads of the tech corporations. So let's take an example. Sam Altman, who's been on everyone's lips again lately, and rightfully so, he programmed the AI, the ChatGPT AI. He has officially said that what matters to him is Tikkun Olam. You can Google Sam Altman and Tikkun Olam. Of course, you could say, well, he just means making the world a better place. But I looked into it very closely. I also looked very closely at Mark Zuckerberg, at which fraternity he belonged to. A lot of people don't know that he was in a fraternity. I took a very close look at that fraternity. And it's all about a spiritual war against humanity. Nothing else matters in the slightest, except, of course, they're just helpers of helpers. So, for example, when it comes to the wars in the Middle East, the half-awakened always say it's about oil. No, it's not about oil at all. Oil is just the lubricant, because you need money to finance all of this. In the Middle East, it's all about Israel, in all these wars. And to buy people off, they tell them, yeah, you can get the oil and so on. In the same way, transhumanism is an anti-divine movement where humans elevate themselves to the status of gods. But this is spiritual, it's actually a religious topic. When transhumanists make themselves into gods, Lucifer, I'll go into more detail about what that really means in my next book, but it's something Luciferian, where humans elevate themselves to godhood and merge with machines. Even Yuval Harari has studied Jewish teachings very thoroughly, is now officially an atheist, but ultimately atheism is also just a belief. And of course, there are those people within, those who aren't at the top of the pyramid, who say, yeah, we just want to monitor people and are basically totalitarian. But these secret societies, as the name suggests, are secret, and at the very top, it's purely a spiritual war. And specifically, it's against the forces of evil. We could do another show about that sometime. The archons. So, in the spiritual world, there aren't just good forces, but also evil ones. And it's exactly those, everything else is completely unimportant nonsense. And you notice, you've now mentioned certain people, and I don't know what they know. It's exactly the opposite of what these people say. Those are just side issues. It's about this spiritual war, and if you don't understand that, then you really don't know what it's all about. All the rest is just a sideshow. Right versus left, a bit more robots or less, a bit more internet or less. It's a spiritual war and nothing else. It started over 2,000 years ago. And you just have to take a look at all the quotes I've thrown at you here. And nobody talks about it. It's not because it's unimportant, but because it's important. We know this from the mainstream media, that they don't talk about what's actually important.
There's something that's an important distinction for me in this conversation. You mentioned beforehand, since we've been in contact about this sensitive topic for a while now, and you've said several times before, that you can't just lump Christians, Muslims, and Jews all together, but that there are certain circles who take things to the extreme, who actually want to push this forward, who have powerful networks. You've only mentioned a few examples from the big tech companies, but that ordinary Jewish citizens are the ones who have to bear the brunt and pay the price for all this. For example, the current war in Israel, in Palestine, and Gaza is having a very negative impact on European Jews, especially in ordinary communities. Because now they're facing problems, also due to Muslim immigration in Europe and so on. So for you, and you explained this in your book, I read that chapter, that it's actually not anti-Semitism to call out this small group of conspirators, so to speak.
Exactly, that's really important. It's actually even worse than you said. According to their plans, the Jewish population is supposed to suffer the most. And there's also a passage in the Old Testament that says, well, according to their ideas, first all Jews are supposed to go to Israel, and then 2/3 of the Israeli population are supposed to die. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that 2/3 of the world's population will die, but especially the Jewish population, they are the most affected by this whole end-time scenario. In the end, only the good ones, those who follow all these rules, are supposed to remain. And of course, anti-Semitism is also fueled by what's happening in Israel right now. I mean, first of all, radical Muslims are being driven into Europe and are attacking Jews there. And then, of course, it also happens that, because of what's going on in Gaza, there are people who generalize that to all Jews, which is total nonsense, because anyway, in America, the majority of them are left-leaning and actually against Netanyahu. One last good example, which I also included in my book. A larger number of Jews opposed the Iraq War than the average of the American population. And the Iraq War was clearly fought for Israel, there's no doubt about that. But the Jewish population in America mostly opposed it. So, of course, this applies to everyone. It applies to the Jewish population, the Christian population, and the Muslim population. They're all victims in this game. They're being sacrificed by their own elites, just like. As you can see now, also in Germany and in every country, it's the ordinary people who suffer under these policies. And in this case, as I even write right at the beginning of the book, according to their plans, it's the Jewish population that suffers the most. And that's why I also hope that people from all different communities will read the book. I also have to say, I most expect that I'll be able to discuss the book with the rabbi, because, as Marcus Geil also said, they're generally very open to discussion. Discussion is also embedded in the Talmud, although he left out the fact that some things don't arise from dialectics, but whatever. I most expect that from this. Well, I'll write to him, the Jehudei guy, but I don't think he'll respond. But I think most likely, I've seen other international discussions on these topics, and you're most likely to find some rabbi who will discuss it, because he's at least trying to defend it somehow. But in any case, the general Jewish population is probably even more negatively affected by it, percentage-wise, than we are.
So in the end, it's the same system everywhere. A U.S. von der Leyen doesn't serve the Europeans, but rather the EU dictatorship, and again, radical Zionist forces serve certain interests, certain circles and messianic orientations.
Just very briefly, Stefan, I want to say this again. We're talking about 0.01% of the population, the Rothschilds, the Soroses, and so on. That's 0.01% of the population. To project that onto everyone is completely ridiculous. It's not just immoral, it's stupid.
That's an important clarification to make at the end of this interview. It will be polarizing again. It will upset a lot of people, but hopefully it will also inspire many. I hope that as a result of this interview, this conversation, a genuine spiritual discussion will follow with you, that Christians will reach out, that people from all areas, as you mentioned rabbis, will get involved. To continue clarifying things here, because I think a clarifying conversation and a clear statement would actually be helpful. Someone saying, yes, we stand for all of that, but we see this or that quite differently. We see things differently today. That would simply be important for your research. You didn't find any such statements in your research, did you? And that's why we've delved deeper into this topic today in this direction, because we also believe that it should remain rented property. And Charlie Kirk, just to bring it back around, already had certain topics on his radar and had announced that he would address them. But he didn't do it, and he was taken out beforehand by whoever it was.
Sorry, but Kenneth Owens also said that he went through a spiritual transformation. And I think he is. Maybe it's not exactly what I'm saying, because Kenneth Owens is also Catholic, and she didn't quite get it either. But I think, basically, he was already on the trail of this topic.
We probably won't find out anytime soon, but many of his colleagues in the U.S., Kenneth Owens, for example, have made it very clear we won't stop until the truth comes to light. And since they are very close to the case and his wife also seems very cooperative, you can expect that there will be a lot more to see and hear in the coming weeks and months. We will keep following this for you on Alpha One. We will continue to tackle the hot topics. And we will discuss and debate controversial issues journalistically, just as you intentionally don't see or hear in public broadcasting and corporate media. But I believe that an informed society, a democratic society, simply needs controversial debates, pros and cons. All arguments need to be put on the table. And then, that's how. Through verbal exchange and discourse, something emerges that moves us closer to the truth. And if you always cover up one side, if you always conceal one side, then that side shouldn't be surprised if there are inaccuracies in the research here and there, because everything is being hidden and covered up. And if, as a result, there are sometimes exaggerations that might not even be entirely accurate, it's because we can only uncover what they are desperately trying to keep hidden. Oliver Janich, thank you for your research and thank you for this conversation that we were able to have today. I wish you all the best in the meantime.
Thank you very much, and put on your armor.
It's always on underneath, even if, as we've seen, it doesn't always help when it counts. But we keep at it. We won't let ourselves be intimidated. If you appreciate what we do, please support us by making a purchase at Alfie Job. Today, in particular, we recommend this book, The Open Secret by Oliver Janich, but also many other items. Or support us through the donation options that are still available. For example, PayPal still works, as do credit card and direct debit, because for months now we haven't had an active and stable donation account. By now, we've had over 15 bank accounts, the most recent ones in Belgium, the UK, or Italy. We didn't even announce those to the public anymore. At this point, we have more than 15 bank accounts. We've had accounts closed on us, but we're working on a stable solution, and I hope that by October I can finally share some good news. Until then, thank you for your support. Please share this video, spread it further. We have no problem if you download it completely, upload it to YouTube, or post it on Telegram. We're not going to file copyright claims like some other media are currently trying to do with us. We want it to be shared. For us, it's all about the content. All the best to you, and see you next time on Alpha One.